take a look at one of the themes of the summer school, which is computational law. And what I will do today is give a quick introduction to the overall subject of computational law, as I understand it. And I will also show some of the work that has been done within our research program over the last year or so. This is a huge subject, so please feel free to interrupt me. We can sort of take tangents, deep dives at any time. They're not seeing the screen. Yeah, okay, I'll do I've got my thing up now, so let's do this. Okay, so I've got this. Let me know if the font is too small, but this is all in the day 6. So I don't know if I don't know if this has been merged, but this should be available under the GitHub GFSS 2021 day 6 README. Has been merged? Okay, great. So everybody should be able to access this. Sorry? I'm not sharing screen again. What happened to the share screen? Sorry, my screen share died. Let's resume my screen share. Is my screen share working now? Okay. All right, let me know if I have any more problems like that. I'm just gonna bring up the GitHub repo here and we can get everybody on the same page. So I'm hoping to give enough information this morning to do some interesting exercises this afternoon. So this afternoon, what I would like to attempt is to, with everybody's help, develop an application grammar for computational law. A very, very simple one, very simple language, but with all of the important moving parts present. So what I'll do this morning is give enough of a background to say, these are some of the challenges, these are some of the requirements, these are the goals. And then this afternoon, we can try to respond to some of those challenges. Does that sound okay to everyone? And I hope the people online are also going to be able to follow along and do this. I hope the time zones are not too bad for you. So I've got a related presentation here. It's called Sneak Peek at L4. So I'll be jumping back and forth between these things. But this is the goal for today. I hope this is feasible. We'll get through hopefully at least half of this. We'll see how much we can do. And I will be asking for all of your help. I'm not going to do this on my own. Now that you've all had a week of GF, I think I will be asking you how to do what I want to do. Okay, so this is not just going to be me like showing you how to do stuff. Does that make sense? Okay, so we'll be just doing some background for the next couple hours, and then we will start doing an attempt at a solution. Okay, so I'm going to start my talk now. Just so you know, I don't like talking about myself very much, but over the weekend, I thought maybe I should give a bit of background on my bio. So I dumped a whole bunch of text in the introduce yourself chat on Discord. And so you can go there if my presentation gets boring, and you can be even more bored by my bio. Okay, so a few years ago, when was Riga? 2017? Yeah, 2017. So I attended the GF Summer School in 2017 in Latvia. And when I was there, I came across this legal sentence. It was just some law from like 100 years ago in America. So I'm not saying this is the best example of what legal writing looks like, but the fact that I just randomly encountered this, screen sharing has stopped because your external display has been disconnected. Well, that's distressing. I'm still here. Is my sharing working? Okay. It's just spontaneously turning off, so I apologize for that. So the text of this sentence, this is an interesting sentence because if you count the number of words in this sentence, there are over 1,000 words in this one sentence, and it just keeps going. There's no full stop, there's no period. This is one long sentence. And that's pretty insane, right? Here's the sentence, And if we look for the number of words, it is 1105 words, one sentence. And apparently this is how people used to write law. I don't know when they started doing this. I don't know when they stopped. But when you read old laws, you will see a huge amount of text that just looks like this. And even new laws, you know, like they go on and on and on. So when you read this, you shake your head, right? And you're like, this is insane, because this feels like a compiled object, right? It's like object code that's been compiled from some sort of higher level language. But the question is, like, what was the higher level language? I'm pretty sure that 100 years ago, nobody was doing any programming. And so there's some high level representation in some lawyer's head. That lawyer is now dead. And that this is what we're left with, right? And when I look at something like this, I think, okay, surely there is some structure to this thing, right? I'm going to try and reverse engineer this. I want to decompile it. I want to see like what the blobs are, because you can see that there are certain repeating chunks, which look like an inline function, right? So it's like, oh, you keep talking about sections 233, 170 to 233, 315, and something has to do with like something taking effect. So this evidently is a sort of patch, right? It's a diff. They're trying to run a commit against some existing law that has been repealed, but they're saying, okay, well, after we repeal some law, we still want to preserve some chunks of it. So some of it is going to work and some of it is not, but we've got this very complicated set of instructions about like the stuff that used to work is still going to work, and the stuff that is now new is going to pretend that it was old, right? And so you end up with these really complicated structures. And so we're going to talk about some of the logics that are in this kind of sentence, and like the sort of like internal complexity of this thing. Certain things may proceed as if this law had not taken effect. Like this is one of the classic paradoxes, right? It's like, I always tell lies, or we are going to operate as though this law did not operate. It's like, okay, how do you think through that? This is one of those classic logic puzzles, right? The knights and knaves. He always tells the truth. I always tell lies. How do you read this stuff? And how do you sort of parse out the semantics? So when I read this sentence, I was like, okay, this is kind of an interesting sentence. If we can solve this, I'm sure we can solve a whole bunch of other things. And it makes you want to sort of go upstream. So the question is, like, what is upstream? And can we make that explicit? And can we bring some software to it? Can we create a compiler, a parser, interpreter, a logic, a semantics, all of that stuff? So here are some other legal sentences. I'm going to give a few examples of the kinds of sentences that we see in this building, in this school of law. We encounter this sort of text all the time. So this example comes from Y Combinator. Okay, this is Y Combinator a few years ago came out with an investment agreement that is incredibly popular in Silicon Valley. If you're doing an early stage startup, you will probably touch this sort of thing. And already you can see that it's a little messy, right? Like when you download this thing, it's going to be a Word file. And the first thing you see is there are 4 versions of this thing. Why are there 4 versions? Because there are evidently 2 toggleable sort of bits here. You can have a discount or no discount. You can have a valuation cap or no valuation cap. 2 times 2, you get 4. And I just shuddered to think, like, what if there were like 4 things that you could fiddle with? Would you end up with 16 versions of this agreement? Like, you guys are having this like explosion of state, right? We call this the state space explosion problem. They had to stop at like 4 variants of two elements here. But if you had 3 elements, 8, 4, 16, 5 elements, you get to 32. You're like, okay, there has to be a better way to manage this kind of complexity. So if you download this file, you'll get a Word document. And the Word document, I won't go into all of it. I just want to show some fragments of legal sentences. And then we will try to figure out the semantics of those legal sentences and build a grammar for them. But Here's basically your JSON. It's like key value pairs. And then here we've got the event section that has 3 events that we'll look at: equity financing, liquidity event. I'm not enjoying Microsoft Word, thank you. And dissolution event, right? So those are the 3 major events. And I'm going to show you the text of these things. I'm going to take this stuff and reformat this sentence, right? It's not as long as the other one, but still kind of a mess. So the equity financing sentence says this. Okay, so just trying to absorb that for a little bit. And then I'll show you the second sentence, and you can start to see some similarities in the structure between these sentences. And my screen keeps going off. Has this been happening to anybody else? Only to me, great. I have a very special relationship with technology, and this is some of it. If you want to pull this up on your own screen at home, it's all in the GitHub. So the structure of this thing, right? The structure of this thing looks like, to me, it says if some event happens while our state machine is in a certain state, then when that event happens, some automatic process will occur in which we have to do a little bit of like basic arithmetic, right? Here, if some event happens while the machine is in a certain state, then some automatic thing happens in which we do a little bit of arithmetic, and we have to compute this divided by that greater than this. Not difficult. And there's a little bit of a deadline idea, right? If dissolution, if a certain event happens while the machine is in a certain state, then automatically one of the parties will obtain something that is equal to this other variable. It's off again. The error message I get is screen sharing has stopped because, okay, equal to this thing, and then it is immediately payable to this person immediately prior to this thing. So what do we have here, right? Let's analyze the semantics of these kinds of statements. We see if some event occurs during some state. So we need a logic for some sort of state machine, finite automata, Petri net, something that deals with states and transitions. These events are defined in terms of primitive qualifiers. So screen sharing has stopped because your external display has been disconnected. I'm pretty sure my external display is not disconnecting. Well, we'll just keep doing that. This is the Apple branded connection. So I've got all the right adapters. You want to try
I want to try switching.
Okay, let's try the other Apple branded adapter.
This is Raven. I don't know if you need it.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. We are reconnecting. Any questions so far from the chat? I'm going to pull up the chat window and see if anybody has anything to say about any of this. Sound quality is good. Audio is perfect. Okay. Yeah, you can hear me. You just can't see me. All right, I've plugged in the other thing, and now we're going to try again. All right, well, let's see if this thing does any better. Okay, so here's the logic, right? So if some event happens, we need some sort of like predicate first order logic, because some of these events are defined as like, this is a qualifying event, this is not a qualifying event based on these inputs. So we need a predicate kind of logic. Then some party must perform some action, and then they parameterize these actions by saying, okay, you need to pay somebody. How much do you need to pay? Well, the amount that you need to pay is going to be a parameter that is computed as some like fairly simple mathematical expression. And if we were doing this in something like Python or JavaScript, we would say some party has to take some action, which is a method, and the arguments to the method are computed as blah, 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 right? And this is what a lot of law actually looks like. It's a very simple, like word problem version of mathematical software specifications. So there's a need for a little bit of a temporal logic, because we say you need to do this thing immediately, or you need to do this thing immediately before some deadline. So we're dealing with timed automata, so we need a temporal logic. And by the way, did you notice the type error? Did you see the bug in this contract under liquidity event, right? So here in dissolution event, we see if something happens, then the investor is automatically entitled to receive some money, right? Because like humans can have money. Here we see the safe will automatically convert into, okay, some other security, some other instrument, right? So the safe is one type of investment instrument. Shares of say preferred stock is another type of investment instrument. So we're at least doing a sort of type safe casting between two different types here that are within the same sort of type family. And here we have liquidity event. This safe will automatically be entitled to receive a portion of proceeds. Would you agree that this doesn't quite feel right? It's like the safe can't really receive money, right? It's like the holder of this safe will receive the money. The investor who owns the safe will receive a portion of proceeds. And so this, like just reading any random legal text, you very quickly say, oh, you know, this feels like a type error. This doesn't seem quite right. And so this sort of jumped out at me. Any thoughts? Agree, disagree?
I'm imagining, like, I didn't think of it, because when I read it, I just thought that it was, oh, this must be a literary convention in this genre, which I don't know. So
That's right.
Don't know.
Yeah, so the literary convention in question here is metonymy. Does anybody know metonymy and synecdoche? So the substitution of the name of an attribute or adjunct for that of the thing meant, right? So the business people, the suits. Let's go horse racing. Let's go to the turf club. Closely related to the idea of synecdoche. A part is made to represent the whole, or vice versa, right? So you get these like literary genre where two ideas are just like squished together. Because why do we do this? Because people who go to law school and become lawyers are, you know, they're usually pretty smart people. And when you have a reasonably smart person reading a sentence like this, they're like, well, obviously what the author meant was this. And so you proceed without any difficulty. However, when you have two smart people in the room who are financially motivated to disagree with each other, then they apply their intelligence to finding fault and finding misinterpretations of the language. So it's you know, there's pros and cons to having humans be your ultimate interpreter, because there's a lot of humans out there. So thank you, metonym. Yes, perfect. Okay, so this is the structure, right, of this sort of legal language. Let's have a look at a third example of another investment agreement. This is a different investment security. It's called the KISS, Keep It Simple Security. And here we're looking at another example of specifically, what does this instrument mean? What is a conversion share? And this definition is really interesting. I'll let you just read this for a moment. So if I can sort of talk about this, this looks to me like a case statement, right? It's saying, okay, some conversion is happening. That's why they're conversion shares. But evidently there are different subtypes of what a conversion could be. There could be a section 2.1 conversion, a section 2.2 conversion, or a section 2.3 conversion. And in each one of these subtypes of conversion shares evaluates to a different thing. Okay, so if we're doing this in Haskell, maybe what we're maybe it looks like this. Okay, so a conversion share depends on the context for this conversion. We've got a company going on, and then we're going to have a little bit of IO because we need to reach out to the internet to say, oh, we're going to include the stuff available at www.seriesseed.com. And if we are unable to download those documents, then the company and the shareholders have to agree what to do now that the website is gone. So they're like, okay, the Internet Archive didn't archive these old documents, so we got a 404 not found. So now I have to deal with like what to do in that failure mode, which is why we need IO. And so turning like legal statements into code is kind of a fun exercise, because you realize that a lot of the structures that you have in software actually show up in law. And it's like, you read legal text and you're like, oh, these people were trying to like write a program. They just didn't have a programming language to write their program in. So they wrote their program in English, which is not a great programming language. So our goal at this research program is to give people a better programming language than English to work with. So this is kind of the condensed and code version of like, okay, suppose the conversion context is section 2.1 or 2.2 or 2.3. Then if the company has elected for like shadow shares, then we create this kind of security. Otherwise we create that kind of security, and that's it, right? It's a very terse way of expressing what was in the legal code. Now, if we just did this and we stopped here, then this code would be an implementation of the legal text. What we actually want is to have a specification that is just as expressive as the legal text that we can then compile back to natural language. So like, this is something that you can compile and you can run. But if I wanted to compile this to English rather than to like machine code, how do we do that, right? That's the challenge for us. How do we take a specification like this and not just like run it, not just implement it, but how do we turn it into natural language again so that a judge can read this, right? Or a customer can read this. So this is a challenge for us because we're dealing with all kinds of different paradigm issues. We've got declarative paradigms, we've got procedural paradigms, we've got specification paradigms, we've got implementation paradigms. So that is the challenge for us today. Okay, so I think that that goal can be achieved because legal language already reads like something that was compiled, right? We talked about that. So there's a book called The Manual of Style for Contract Drafting. This has been through 4 editions. It's by this, I hope he doesn't mind if I call him a grumpy curmudgeon, who tweets very actively. So let me just click on this. So Ken Adams is the expert on contract style and contract drafting. And in his book, he says, well, there's actually a certain very limited set of categories of contract language. So I apologize for boring some of the people who've seen this before, but for the people who haven't, I hope this is useful. So he says, there are performative statements. There are conditions in a contract. And then there are rules that are sort of deontic, regulative, prescriptive, that basically say, you must do this, you may do this, you must not do this. There are what he calls alethic rules that basically say, well, if you're going to sign all the documents, the signing happens at this place on this date. So it's just like a fact. And then there are this language of policy that says, this agreement terminates on this date, or this is going to be governed by Singapore law or governed by Delaware law or whatever. And he says, that's it. These are the categories of contract language. There are no other sentences that belong in a contract. So if, for example, you want to say in the contract, the parties believing that this thing has happened in the past would now like to strengthen their relationship by signing this contract. It's like, okay, that doesn't mean anything, right? It doesn't have some, it's not useful. So Ken Adams says things like that, any assumptions or any sort of like expressions of like feeling or intent do not belong in the contract, take it out. And that rigor tells me that we're dealing with something that's very close to being something that you can formalize, right? You can formalize a language where you've got, I must do this, you must do that. You can say, if the moon is full, then I must do this, and you must do that. You can say, I hereby promise to pay you this much right away. That's a performative statement. You can say, you can trust that I'm signing this contract in good faith because at this time I have no lawsuits pending against me. I know that, you know, like I represent and warrant that we have at least $1 million in the bank. So these are declarations. So these are all the kinds of sentences you find in a contract. And this is going to be the guide to our application grammar. You can say, okay, let's just take each one of these things and turn it into whatever cat, lin cat, fun sort of thing that GF knows, right? So that's what gives me confidence that our project will succeed, okay? Because if we wanted to say, okay, we've got a bunch of legal sentences, some of them are regulative that say you must do something, and then some of them are constitutive, and that they say like, you know, you are allowed to park here if the car is blue, right? Or, so what does it mean for a car to be blue? A car is blue if the paint is between this wavelength and this wavelength, right? That's a constitutive rule. So these are the sentences. And you can say, well, each one of these kinds of sentences is made up of these subparts that we just discussed, right? Like under these events, under these conditions, this party must do this action by this deadline. Or you could say, you know, under these conditions, this thing is this thing. So this is how I begin to think about breaking down. I know my indentation isn't right, but just for pedagogical purposes, I'm reformatting. So it turns out that people have been thinking about this kind of thing for a very long time. What is the logical structure of laws? What is the logical structure of contracts? And if you look at some of the academic literature, you will see that there are things like ACE rules out there. So in case ACE is new to you, ACE is this thing called Attempto-Controlled English. And there's a Wikipedia piece on it. Tobias Kuhn did his whole PhD on this. He's basically the primary author of all this stuff. So what is ACE? ACE is a CNL. It's a controlled natural language that is actually, you know, it looks like English, but it is also a formal language, right? So this is kind of at the intersection between, right? We're very used to seeing these kinds of diagrams now, right? So in ACE, these are legal examples of sentences in that language. So this is kind of cool, right? Like you can see that the grammar of ACE has determiners, and then those determiners turn into universal quantification, existential quantification. So we're taking these natural language sentences, turning them into formal logic. And the rules are pretty strict, right? It is a formal language, so you have to obey these rules. We've got anaphora, we've got, and so this stuff then gets parsed into a discourse representation structure, which is basically some sort of first order predicate expression. And then from there, you can turn into other things, okay? Now, the cool thing about ACE is that this feels like the obvious candidate for something that we can do in GF, right? Because it's like, we've got all this machinery in GF, and GF could just like try and do this. And it turns out that we do in fact have ACE available in GF. So there's been this implementation, and maybe we'll be able to make use of this later today. But this should now be very familiar to you. if you have a sentence like this, GF can parse it. And then once you have it turned into the abstract syntax, you can then turn it back into a bunch of different languages. So this is cool, right? This helps us because there's a huge amount of infrastructure that we don't need to reinvent. So that's great. So ACE is attempt-to-controlled English. On top of ACE, there is ACE rules, which allows you to specify certain rules in ACE. And from there, you can say, okay, well, now we have a rule language. And we can turn this rule language into things that are closer to our application domain, which is computational law. Now, the original context for ACE and ACE rules is the semantic web, right? Let's make the internet machine understandable. Let's borrow all of this stuff and apply it to computational law, okay? So I'm not gonna like try and present ACE right now. There's a lot to it. It's more than 10 years old. But this, I think, is going to be helpful to us. There are other kinds of like rule languages, formal expression languages in a more, I'm going to go to Alloy Tools. Okay, no dash. All right, so this is beginning to be part of a lot of undergrad curriculums. People are studying this at places like MIT. This is yet another software modeling specification environment. There are like a bajillion model checking, set solving, timed automata kinds of things out there. This is one of them, but there's, if you've heard of things like SAT SMT, Z3, SMT lib, this is kind of in that same family. And so what you can do in Alloy is, let's see if I can give some examples. So you can say, okay, I'm going to set up some examples. Let's see. Let's have a river crossing puzzle. Okay, so the usual like fox, chicken, grain, boat, farmer. How do you get everybody across? So the way you write this puzzle, apparently there are two solutions. And where's the code? So in a language like this, you can see this is a very, like a lot closer to something like JavaScript and C in terms of the syntax. You declare that there are these objects, right? And each object knows how to eat some other object. And there are these things called farmers, fox, chicken, grain. And they're all singletons. And we know that a fox likes to eat the chicken likes to eat the grain. We can be on either side of the river, so you can be near or far. And then we have this thing that knows how to cross the river. So it changes the state of certain things. And that's it. This is how you set up that problem. And this is enough information for Alloy to solve it. Now, this is interesting because you set up the problem in a really declarative kind of way. You hit run, and Alloy comes back and says, here is a solution to the river crossing problem. The chicken goes across, the goat goes across, and so on. The relevance of this to computational law, what does this have to do with law, is in law, we often face similar situations. We're not trying to cross the river, but we are trying to achieve some goal that is governed by this really complex system of rules. And basically what it boils down to is like, if you want to graduate by this date, you need to take this class. But before you can take this class, you have to take this other class. But if you want to take this other class, the problem is there's a scheduling conflict, so you can't take both of these classes in the same semester. So like the undergrads are like nodding their heads, right? Everybody's familiar with this kind of situation. So like, maybe you're like, okay, instead of trying to figure out my whole class schedule myself, I'll just like program it into Alloy, or I'll program it into the system, and I will let the system tell me what classes I'm supposed to sign up for, right? So this is the analogies to like laws and rule systems begin to show up very, very quickly. And so, imagine if you could write down all of this like class schedule stuff in L4. L4, we could run a rule engine that could then tell you what classes you need to take, right? So these are some of the existing like ways to deal with rules. I'm going to show you real quick just a couple more, and then we will try to move on to like the specific logics of laws and contracts. So legal rule ML is this thing that has showed up relatively recently. It's been under development for a very long time. And they just last year, in April 2020, they came out with their version 1.0. And legal rule ML basically gives you an XML representation for representing legal rules. And so I consider this a really useful document, even if we don't end up encoding things into XML, because that's not necessarily my idea of a good time. It's still useful to look at how they think about, whoops. Let me try and get my clicking right. Okay, so 4.2, modeling legal norms. You can look at how they think about the logic of how to model laws in software. So they say, okay, there's a whole bunch of scholarship out there. We're just going to compress it into, here's this logic, here's this language. If A, 1, 2, 3, then C, right? This is one way of representing rules. Sometimes you need defeasibility. You can say, this rule applies except under certain conditions. And there are different ways of phrasing these defeasibility relations. So you can say, sometimes this is true, this is always true, this is always not true, or sometimes it's always not true based on this or that. They've come up with this system of very nice arrows to represent these kinds of relations. And so we've got, so reading this is a very, very quick introduction to how to think about the kinds of defeasibility you see in law, where in law, it will say, notwithstanding this, or despite this clause, or subject to this other clause, right? These are the kinds of situations where you need to model defeasibility. And they've got their whole like meta model UML kind of thing going on. We talked previously about constitutive rules. We talked about regulative rules. Legal rule ML also talks about these things. So it's useful to read through and see how they think about these ideas. It's useful to think about how they model modals. So modal operators, like you always must do something, you may do something, you must not do something, right? So they model obligation, permission, and prohibition in this way. And having this modal logic saying, everything just boils down to obligation, permission, or prohibition. This is useful because when you read legal text, when you read a contract, you read a law, there's a lot of fuzzy language in there sometimes. And it's like, they're very flowery and they use a lot of words to say something. But it turns out that actually what they're really saying is it an obligation? Is it a permission or a prohibition? And you just like reduce it to that and you're like, okay, you used a lot of words. I'm just going to use 3 symbols, three letters right here. So we'll talk a little bit more about the ambiguities of some of these logics later on, but I just wanted to give you some of the ideas that you see in legal rule ML, because we want to also capture some of these ideas in our language in L4. Now, the thing that makes a legal, like a human law, different from a law in physics is that in physics, like you can't break the laws. Like a law in physics is just a law. It's like, this is how the world works. And there's no way to go faster than the speed of light. That's why it's called the law. It's the law of gravity, right? Because if you let go, it's going to drop, right? The thing about human laws is that they can be broken. And that's why they're not physical laws. And so we need a way of saying, okay, so even though this is a law, what happens when the law has been broken? And are you allowed to fix it? You know, like if you violated an obligation, are you allowed to say, okay, I'm going to pay this penalty, and then I'm going to pretend that I never broke the law in the first place? That's what they call a reparation pathway. So legal RuleML has actually been really sort of pragmatic in the sense that they're like, okay, given this piece of text, there are multiple ways to read this piece of text. There are ambiguous interpretations. So we're just going to have like an XML thing for allowing multiple interpretations. And so we'll say, okay, based on, you know, if you're this judge on Tuesday, maybe you interpret this ambiguous piece of text to this meaning. If you're this other judge on Thursday, maybe you read the same text, but it comes out with that meaning. Fine. Let's just provide ways to encode both alternatives so that your reasoner can just go on and say, well, based on, you know, this train of thought, or based on this train of thought, you probably want to try and get this judge on Tuesday. So that's pretty pragmatic. So this is all this is the core of legal RuleML. They also got ideas like isomorphism. They say, look, you know, if you've got a rule, you want to be able to point to where that rule came from. And so we've got this idea of a legal source, and then like if the legal source is a URL, then fantastic, that's great. So all of this stuff, I could go into a ton of detail about like the semantics of legal RuleML, how it builds on top of RuleML, how RuleML itself is made up of like 3 different sub-components of like deliberation, consumer, reaction, RuleML. I'm not going to talk about all that today because that would bore you to tears, but I will just point out that these ideas are out there. And in the world of computational law, you will very, very frequently run across these names because they've been thinking about these things for a very long time. And of course, one of those names is Guido Governatore, who is absolutely prolific, and you just can't get away from him in this space. He has published on absolutely everything. Adam Weiner, by the way, we're trying to write to him and see if he's interested in like spending some time with us on like sabbatical, or you know, maybe he might be interested in like doing a short seminar with us or some kind of relationship. So that'd be fun. Anyway, moving on from that. So these are all different ways to formally represent rules. And the other special theme of our GF Summer School is the idea of abstract Wikipedia, right? So we've heard a little bit about that previously. I just wanted to point out this resource, which is that there's this thing called ACE-Wiki, which is a wiki for attempto-controlled English. And you end up with something that kind of looks like controlled natural language. It looks like English, but it's actually like formal. And the kind of content that you put into this is a little bit like the stuff that's in Wikipedia. So they've been working on this in conjunction with GF for quite a while. So this is maybe something that we can look at another time when we get more into the abstract Wikipedia piece of it. But anyway, we are following in the footsteps of giants, and people have been thinking about this for a very long time. And one of the more interesting papers in the space, oh, look at that, the usual suspects here. How do we translate between language and logic? So this paper talks about what is easy, what is difficult, and how do we apply GF to some of these problems. So I'm not going to like try and represent this paper right now, but it is available out there and you can click to it from the GitHub README here. Okay, so now is a good time to sort of pause and just try and like reflect a little bit. Any thoughts about any of this? Does this make sense? Everybody already knows all this stuff. Okay, cool. Any questions from anyone online? Any remarks? Have I lost everyone?
People have done a lot of different pieces. Hopefully we can just
Yeah, isn't it great that like people have done all the thinking, right? Like academia is this amazing wellspring of just like untapped potential. So, our challenge is to take all of this stuff that's been done in academia and actually make it useful. Okay. Yeah, let me see if I can show you something immediately relevant to this. Right, so I'll show you an example of what's kind of potentially relevant. Sorry, my computer is not behaving. So I was just like, on the toilet this morning, I was scrolling through Twitter, and and so I came across this, and people had a lot of feelings about this apparently. And so he was basically saying, look, if you are in the US, right, and then you get COVID while you are traveling and you get sick, right, you need treatment or hospitalization. The US is famous for being the country with like the most broken healthcare system in the world. And his specific question was, do you know whether your insurance will cover you when you are out of state? And in America, they have this idea of in-network insurance providers, right, where some doctors are approved, and if you go there, then insurance will pay for it. If you go to a doctor who's not approved, insurance will not pay for it. In-network, out of network, in-state, out of state. There's a lot of details. So, there's a lot of people, there's like a million people in America who have this kind of anxiety, right? Because I need to go to California and I might get COVID. If I get COVID, I might need to go to the hospital. If I go to the hospital, what will my hospital bill be? And Americans love to talk about how, I got sick and I suddenly owed them $200,000 and now I'm bankrupt. So one of the reasons that we think doing computational law is important is because we might be able to help people answer these questions, right? Like insurance is this huge, complex rule system. If we're able to encode the rule system, and if we're able to help people sort of like run scenarios and explore, then they can start to answer these questions, right? Maybe they will answer the question by saying, okay, I'm planning to drive across America from this city to this city, and who knows, I might get sick at anywhere along the way. Maybe computational law that has absorbed all the insurance rules will be able to tell you when you drive, you need to do this because you need to stay out of this state, right? You don't want to pass through Tennessee if you can help it. Sorry, Tennessee. Some stereotypes there. But, like this is the really useful stuff that people care about. And the way to help them answer these questions is computational law. Okay, so this is not just like abstruse theoretical academic stuff. It's like we may end up helping save somebody's life. We may save them from bankruptcy. We may, like help them just like get through life a little bit more easily without having to pay a lawyer a lot of money, only for the lawyer to say, well, that's an interesting question. The answer is, it depends. Like we want to be able to tell people, what does it depend on? Like I want to be able to like right click on this thing and see the properties and like expand the answer and like just really understand it. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the use cases that we have explored here at the center. And by the way, is the air conditioning on or off? Is it on? It felt a lot colder last week. Okay, well, as long as we're not about to suffocate. Okay, so sorry about that. So we'll continue. So what we've been doing at the center is we've been saying to people, okay, please, we don't want to be just like writing papers and writing code in a vacuum. We want to make sure that the stuff that we do is going to be useful and relevant. Maybe it's like relevant to the insurance industry, right? And so some of our friends in the government have come to us and said, there's these like useful things that we would like to make a little bit more useful. Here's a piece of law. Can you turn this into sort of like a web app, right? Where if I'm an end user, if I'm a consumer of this law, I'm reading it and I'm trying to figure it out, and it's very complicated. I don't really understand it. Can I have some sort of form or wizard that helps me make sense of this law? And so Rule 34 is one of our use cases. We've been working through this. We've been encoding it. We've been doing sort of machine automated reasoning over it. We've pushed it through a whole bunch of different formalisms. And one of the first things that you notice about this is, okay, you've got these definitional rules, which are recursive. You've got, so you can say this thing means this, right? And if you're a programmer, you're looking at this, you're like, oh, this is a variable definition, basically, right? Like this thing means this thing, or it's a predicate definition. In Prolog, it'd be like, something is an executive appointment if it is one of these things, or one of these things, or one of these things, or one of these things. So these are predicate definitions. The reason we talk so much about defeasibility, we've been talking about defeasibility, is because in laws, you very frequently see these kinds of connections between clauses. You say subject to paragraph 1, subject to paragraph 1, subject to paragraph 1, right? So this is an example of defeasible logic. This thing is subject to that thing. This thing despite that thing. And then you need like fairly fine-grained stuff, despite paragraph 1b, but subject to paragraph 1a and c to f, right? So reading this, you're like, okay, this is structure, and we need some way to capture this structure. But it's so tantalizingly close, right? Because as a programmer, like the bit of your brain that knows how to crunch this stuff is like, it's already really well developed, and it's just waiting to go, right? So except as provided in paragraphs 2 to 5. One of the things we want to do in our research program is figure out, what does it actually mean when somebody says except as provided, subject to paragraph? What are the semantics of this sort of subject to relation? And then I'm going to point out, Inari earlier said, you know, this whole language legal thing is like a particular stylized discourse. It's kind of a dialect of English, and it has a certain meaning. So number 7 here says, to avoid doubt, for the avoidance of doubt, nothing in this rule prohibits a legal practitioner from doing anything in any institution set on the 3rd schedule. Which, like, if you read this literally, it's like, no, that's actually not true, because there could be things that prohibit a legal practitioner. What you are trying to say in the sentence is that this is a extreme high priority override of everything else. And the way they phrase it is, to avoid doubt, nothing in this rule prohibits blah, which is like a really, it just feels like the sledgehammer. It's like, you've got all these rules, and then we say nothing in this rule prohibits something else. And you're like, okay, well, fine, you override everything. But it's kind of rude the way you said it in terms of formal logic. So the people who manage this particular law came to us and said, can you know, we get a lot of like support calls on this law, and people call us on our helpline and they're like, I don't really understand this law. Can you help explain it to me? Because I'm in this situation and somebody wants me to take an executive appointment, and I don't know if I'm allowed to or not, because there's just so many words on this page. And the people calling the helpline are actually legal practitioners. So when this use case came to us, we were like, yes, we would love to be able to help lawyers understand law better using our software. So we've done a number of ways of representing this stuff. So in one of our early languages, baby L4, we've been encoding it into this kind of syntax. It turns out that there's actually a lot going on in this text, and there's this whole sort of implied ontology. Some of it is explicitly spelled out at the bottom. Some of it is just implicit, and we have to use our own world knowledge to say, well, you know, a person can be like awesome or cool or authorized to practice. It's all sort of, it's inferable, I think. So in a future version of our language, This is the very first like baby steps version of L4. This is not what we're expecting people in practice to actually program in. You can think of this as like the GHC core, first simplest set of primitives, but we are actively developing this language. So everything that you see in terms of concrete syntax for L4, everything you see even in terms of the abstract semantics is all under active development. If you find this interesting, I'm talking to the people on the call, if you're listening to the recording of this, if you find this interesting and if you would like to work on this, we do have open positions. So you are welcome to come to Singapore and join us on this. If you can't make it to Singapore, this is an open source project. And so, we will welcome contributors online. So please, like if this stuff tickles your fancy and you want to get involved, we can talk about that. So we've got all these rules. This is kind of the unrolled version of our defeasibility logic, and we just need a slightly more sophisticated approach to it. But I'm just scrolling through this file to give you an impression of how it is possible to take a paragraph and encode it in a formal syntax that looks a lot like code, right? Like we've got all these familiar operators here. We've got, like various kinds of logic here. And there are these relations like I'm a member of this other thing and so on. So what we've learned from doing this is that it is possible to encode this stuff. It is possible for our reasoners to think about it. It's possible to detect like type errors and say, this sentence doesn't actually make any sense. There's, yet another example of metonymy. And every time you encounter metonymy, you have to go run like a typecast conversion from what you said to what you actually meant. But all of this is like tractable, So we went and represented these things in a bunch of different ways. I'll show you the logic gates representation. May take me a minute to sign into this, but let's see if this works. Have I downloaded this? Maybe I haven't. Hold on a sec. Let me see if I can run this thing. I do not have this. Maybe I have a screenshot. I'll just show you the screenshot. Okay, I'm going to click on this presentation, and somewhere in here, I think there's a screenshot of what I want to show you. Oh, I'll talk through some of this other stuff as well. Why am I not seeing the logically stuff? All right, well, I may just have to run it. Okay, I'm going to run this thing. Okay, so what this thing is, logically, it's a user interface for designing circuits, like logic circuits. So you've got like AND gates, OR gates, and so on. I'm going to try and zoom in so you can, I can't zoom in. But so we borrowed this tool, which was originally intended for circuit design, and we repurposed it to represent a sort of legal rule circuit. Let me find what I'm finding. Okay. So all this stuff is in GitHub. If you actually want to, like, if you care enough to check this stuff out, you can see it. So what we did was we manually converted those rules into input switches. So this is meant to be like a light switch on the wall. These switches can be on or off, and then they flow through the circuit, and eventually you get the output. And the output that you're looking for is either you may take the executive appointment or you must not take the executive appointment. So you can see how these input switches turn electricity on and off, and they interact with each other through a system of like OR gates and AND gates. And this is sufficient to represent the kinds of defeasibility that we saw previously. And eventually you end up with a verdict, an outcome, right? So this is a legal rule represented as an electronic circuit. And one of the things that we are in the middle of doing on and off is we want to start with our representation of the rule, and we want to be able to output this kind of circuit, which we can then deal with subsequently in other tools. So the circuit's kind of an advanced thing. We have turned it into GraphViz. But maybe I can, would this be a good time for me to just talk you through a little bit of what the more sophisticated science fiction-y representation looks like? Because we've been encoding Rule 34 for a while in a whole bunch of different ways. I can show you what some other representations look like. Okay. So we're borrowing some ideas from Prolog a little bit. So just the simplest, barest syntax here is we can say the LP is this sort of legal practitioner, and the availability parens LP is a logical predicate that says the legal practitioner's availability to those who may seek the legal practitioner service as a lawyer. That expands to that, that expands to that, that expands to that. So here we've got this really simple conversion to English. In the future, we would like to use GF to handle these conversions, because right now we're just like blasting it out as a template copy paste kind of operation. It would be nice to integrate with GF using PGF to create a little bit more sophistication around these text strings. So I'll show you what Rule 34 looks like. This is one sort of embedded DSL representation where we say, okay, we've got a rule, and it's Rule 34.1. And Rule 34.1 is made up of this huge tree of conditions. And each tree, well, this tree is made of nodes, and each node says, okay, it must not do this. It is not allowed if it detracts from, is incompatible with, or derogates from the dignity of the legal profession. So what I can do is pull up the original text of the law. Pull up the text of the law. I'm just gonna bring this up. Come on, Rule 34. Come back. Behave. Okay, so here's the first sentence, right? A legal practitioner must not accept any executive appointment associated with any of the following businesses. Any business which detracts from, is incompatible with, or derogates from the dignity of the legal profession. Can anybody spot the bug in this sentence? This is just like the first sentence, and there's already a bug. Where is the bug? Where is the error in the sentence? So there, we've got a list, right? We've got a disjunctive list of 3 elements: detracts from, is incompatible with, or derogates from. Okay, and we're pretty confident that this, you can detract from the dignity of. This is a way that people talk about things. Like, oh, look, next door in the accounting profession, they're gonna be like, oh, you're not allowed to like detract from the dignity of the accounting profession. Okay, fine. So this is a common idea of like, Jesus never detracts from the dignity of anyone. Okay, cool. So detracting from the dignity is an idea, right? Being incompatible with the dignity is an idea. Derogating from the dignity is an idea. And here they've refactored it. Literally, they factored that sentence to just a disjunctive list where you can detract from, be incompatible with, or derogate from the dignity of the legal profession, right? So where should this comma be? This comma should be over here, right? Right. So I would claim that if we had generated this sentence using GF, that comma would be in the right place, because GF knows how to do disjunctive lists, and it knows how to like factor these things, right? You can imagine the tree of how this would look in GF, and GF would put the comma in the right place. Agree? Disagree? Thoughts? But because this was written by a fallible human, the comma is in the wrong place. Are commas important in law? It turns out that commas are actually really important in law. There are a huge number of lawsuits, and by huge, I mean like 5 in the last few years, where because the comma was in the wrong place, these people ended up paying like $5 million. Another case, right? In like in 1872, they've had this bug on the books for a long time. Like if you add comma between fruit and plants, oh, suddenly it means for something very different, right? So all of this stuff, like just putting commas in the right place, really, really important. Here's another huge lawsuit in Canada. It was $1 million lawsuit. And they were arguing about this sentence. Shall we take a quick look at this sentence? Okay. Sorry, my scrolling. So where is the ambiguity here? Would we consider this an example of anaphoric ambiguity? Unless and until terminated by 1 year prior notice in writing by the party, okay? So when can you terminate? Can you terminate after the first 5 years? Or can you terminate within the first 5 years, right? Like, do you read this part of the sentence together? Or do you read this part of the sentence, right? Does this unless and until modify this chunk? Or does the unless and until only modify this chunk? So there was a dispute about this. Ken Adams wrote like a massive affidavit to just like give his expert opinion. He had like 60 pages on the use of the comma. And eventually they had to solve this problem by saying, we're in Canada, right? So we're in Quebec, and everything was written in both English and French. So they were like, let's just go read the French version of this thing because the French version doesn't have the ambiguity. So that's how they solved that problem. So it's like, these are the kinds of situations where like commas make a difference. Like, oh, this guy got the death penalty because of a comma. I mean, even if the comma hadn't been an issue, he was probably going to get the death penalty anyway, because he was a sort of political enemy. But like, the point is, these commas do matter, and I would like to see GF create these sentences from our L4 representation so that English, like drafters don't have to write the English. that make sense? Like, is that a legitimate sort of goal? Yeah. Right, we're all like software people, right? All this is very obvious. Okay, let me give one more bug in this piece of code here. Any business which is prohibited by the Act, these rules, or any other subsidiary legislation. So here we have an or, right? These rules or any other subsidiary legislation, which means if it is prohibited by the Act, then it matches. If it's prohibited by these rules, then it matches. If it's prohibited by any other subsidiary legislation made under the Act, then it matches, right? What if it is prohibited by practice directions? But it is not prohibited by a ruling. Why did they choose to use the word and here and not the word or? Is it meaningful that they said and not or? Do I have to see that it's prohibited by the practice direction, and it is prohibited by the guidance note, and it is prohibited by the ruling, then it is prohibited under this section? How do you interpret this? Okay, let's expand that idea. Any practice directions, guidance notes, and rulings relating to professional practice, etiquette, conduct, and discipline issued by the council and the society? No, issued by the council or the society. So it's like, what is your and? What does your or mean? So these are things that like we can solve with a formalism. And these are the things that when you encode this stuff in our formal language, we're like, you have to be absolutely clear about whether it's an or an and. In fact, this is a top level type. So I'm not going to talk through this language in a lot of detail right now. Maybe we'll go into it after lunch, but I just want to point out that our representation of that chunk is unambiguous because, you know, we have types, and the types are explicit about whether they are a set union, a conjunction, a disjunction, a inclusive or, an exclusive or, right? All of these meanings are explicit. So we get to tell people, you know, this is what it means. This is how you interpret it. If you disagree, well, you know, you're wrong. And we can do that before it turns into a lawsuit and before it goes in front of a judge. Okay, any thoughts, questions, comments about any of that so far? So I could go into looking at another example of this. So I'm not going to spend quite as much time as I did with Rule 34, but I will point out that we've got another use case that's come into us under the Personal Data Protection Act, which is Singapore's sort of version of the GDPR. There's the law that says if there's a data breach and like the bad guys break into your AWS S3 cloud and download a whole bunch of stuff that contains like credit card, phone numbers, address, medical conditions. If the bad guys download this stuff, it's a data breach. If you lose a USB drive, if you decommissioned a laptop and it got sold on eBay, that's a data breach. And if a data breach happens, then it might be a notifiable data breach. And if it's a notifiable data breach, then you need to go and notify people. And you need to notify the Personal Data Protection Commission, and you need to notify the people whose information was stolen, right? So this chunk of the law says, if there's been a data breach, you need to figure out if it's notifiable. If it's notifiable, you need to go and tell people, unless you are told not to tell the people. Well, there's a whole bunch of specific detail in here. This is the Act. These are the regulations that expand on the Act. So the Act itself is what, how many pages? It's 4 pages, okay? The regulations are 10 pages, and they say, so the Act, you know, used this term. We're going to expand and say, you know, this is what this term really means. So we're going to say, oh, if it has to do with like passwords, security codes, biometrics, blah, blah, blah. So the regulations are 10 pages and they elaborate the act by saying, oh, you know, like it could lead to harm if you are a vulnerable adult or so 10 pages of explanation. And then the government's like, well, we're not really confident that people are going to be able to go read the actual law by themselves. So we're going to publish a 164-page document, which is the advisory guidelines that explain some of these things in the act and the legislation. And then they're like, okay, but you know, 164 pages is a lot of text. And so probably people aren't going to read 164 pages. So let's write a 40-page document that just focuses on data breaches. So we've got like 4 authoritative-ish documents that hopefully all agree with each other. It turns out that to some extent they overlap, they might start to disagree. We were given the project to formalize some of this stuff, and we have started doing that. We've done the basic baby L4 implementation, but we are also working on the more sophisticated, like sort of futuristic representation. And this is meant to be a little bit closer to what end users will actually code. And hopefully in another 6 months, we'll have like full VS Code support for this. We'll have a bunch of standard libraries. We'll have like a syntax for referring to the original sources. And this is meant to be a little bit more compact than what you've seen previously. It is compact enough that people should be able to write this kind of thing if they've had some training. If they haven't had any training in this language, the goal for this language is that you should still be able to tweak stuff that has been written in this language. Like, somebody might come in and say, okay, you know, the previous version of this law said your reasonable and expeditious steps. What does expeditious mean? Somewhere in some source, in 20.4, it says expeditious means that it has to be less than 30 days. And somebody who is completely untrained might come in and say, okay, my boss says we're going to change 30 days to 45 days. I can do that, right? Like they're going to be a little bit intimidated by this, but when they zoom in down to like line 58, they're like, okay, expeditious means less than or equal to 30 days. I'm going to change that to 45 days, and I'm going to be reasonably confident that I got it right. So 90% of software engineering is maintenance, and I'm expecting that 90% of people interacting with this kind of code is going to be just jumping in and tweaking one line, right? So I think that's a reasonable expectation, and we are starting to build out like a parser, a compiler for all this kind of thing. We want like inline test cases. Like, for example, if there was a misplaced storage drive, this is your scenario, then suppose these things happen, then it's not a notifiable breach. So we're trying to create a language that's this like unholy combination of SQL, SQL, of like Haskell, of JavaScript and Python. You know, we want some of these syntax conventions to be familiar with people with some programming experience. Like, it looks a little bit like JSON. It's typed a little bit like Haskell. Square brackets represent lists. And so we're hoping that this will be accessible, but formal and usable. So those are the challenge, right? That's the goal. Any thoughts about this? Comments? The people in the room have hopefully seen this before. So I'm hoping that the people on Zoom are following. I hope it makes sense. Okay, so one last example, okay? I'm gonna get really quick with this. We've looked at the SAFE, that was the investment agreement that had like the liquidity event, the dissolution event, scenario 2A, 2B, 2C, and so on. We've also started to encode these things into our formalism. You remember, like, if there is a liquidity event before the termination of the safe, this safe will automatically be entitled subject to receive a portion of the proceeds calculated as this and this. So, like, we've taken all of that very verbose English and we've structured it up into a thing that says, given like these things that have happened, this thing is happening now, we're going to define certain things as like, oh, this is the maximum of this amount or that amount. And then we're going to have a payout. And then we have some like mathematics that you compute things. And then we say, look, the rule is this: given a liquidity event, the company must pay to the investor the entitlement amount before the consummation date of the liquidity event. And that's it. Like, this is, I think that people should be able to read this. I think that people should be able to write this without too much training. So this is where we're starting to go with the language. We've only been working on this, like kind of like less than a year-ish. So it's not super mature, but we are pretty optimistic that we will be able to do this stuff. Shall we take a short break? And then, yes, we have a comment. This language looks more like Sparkle than SQL. They're kind of in the same family. SQL is more relational, database oriented. Sparkle is RDF oriented. We can take a quick look at how some of this like semantic web stuff works. You can definitely see the resemblance with SQL, SQL, and Sparkle. They're trying to do sort of relational computing through RDF triples. Select queries, ask, describe. And, like different people have had different approaches to this kind of thing. We have just this week been exploring X algorithms, which is promising to publish normative rules as sort of like database-like. But I'm not going to get into this right now because I don't want to get too derailed. The fact is there are a whole bunch of different existing approaches to trying to do this kind of thing. One thing that the semantic web, OWL, RDF, and Sparkle cannot do is say, what is the capital of Japan? So it can say, okay, Tokyo is the capital of Japan, right? Suppose the year is 800 AD. What is the capital of Japan? Right, so like all the semantic web stuff doesn't have a good way to index by time, right? If the capital of a country changes, which it does very, very slowly, very infrequently, you need to be able to say, well, the capital of the country in this year was this, capital of the country in that year was that. We usually use Donald Trump as the example. Who is Donald Trump's wife? Well, it depends, right? It depends what year it is. So same idea. And unfortunately, semantic web technologies don't deal with time very well. So you may have a response to that, but that is the sort of initial finding that we had. Okay, so we could talk a little bit about any of these things that you see on the screen right now. We could get into vagueness, ambiguity. We've talked already about defeasibility. We could talk about Catalan and default logic. We could talk about like, how do you determine if something is something, right? Sometimes you just have to ask a human, you need an oracle. Why don't we talk about vagueness and ambiguity real quick, because we've already started that discussion. And then we will break for lunch, and then we will come back and we can start building an application grammar in GF to realize all of these ideas that we've talked about this morning. And we will be done by 3:30 this afternoon, and the research program will be completed, and we can all go home. Okay, so let's explore vagueness and ambiguity, because if you look at the if you look at the manual of style of contract drafting, which I hope is going to show up here. Okay, perfect. If you look at his book, he actually talks about, whoops. So Kindle is great, but I have trouble like getting to the contents page sometimes. Okay, there it is. So really interesting to read through the contents page even of this thing. Categories of contract language, we've talked about that previously. One of, like, he's got an entire chapter on sources of uncertain meaning in contract language. He's got an entire chapter on ambiguity, different kinds of ambiguity, imprecision, vagueness, and what we can do. Oh, look, then he's got another chapter on ambiguity, and then he's got another chapter on ambiguity. There's so much ambiguity in legal writing. He's got 3 chapters on ambiguity. Like, it blows the mind, doesn't it? So let's, and he's doing all of this from the point of view of a legal practitioner, sort of like English language expert, but he doesn't come to this as a formalist or a logician, right? So for the next like 5 minutes, let's look at this from the point of view of a logician. Suppose you are house sitting for me, right? And I'm showing you around the house, and I'm like, okay, here's, you gotta feed the cat, you gotta feed the dog. Here's how you fix the toilet when the toilet doesn't flush. And by the way, these are the plants. Can you please water the plants for me? And you ask, oh, well, okay, so how much water do I need to give the plants? And I say to you, oh, well, you know, you can't give these plants too much water. And then I come back in a month and the plants are all dead. Why are the plants dead?
We didn't quantify how much is too much water.
That's right. And also because I didn't quantify what it means by you can't give.
It may not, or
You may not, you should not, may not overwater the plants, right? What is the other interpretation?
We are assuming sunlight is
Right. There's no amount of water that is too much for this plant. Right? Because maybe the plant is like it's a seagrass and it's in the aquarium, right? So these are the 2 possible interpretations of exactly the same sentence, which are exactly opposite, right? So like these, there is actually logic behind this. Like if you look at the alithic modality, so these are all called modals, and we've talked about modals a little bit last week in GF. This deals with like truth, right? So this is the classic, you can't give these plants too much water. So as they say, right, the dilemma is easily resolved through paralinguistic cues by intelligent people who are trying their hardest to understand the speaker. And because they're listening, right, in real time, they can pause, they can interrupt, and they can ask for explanation. If you are in a courtroom, all of that intelligence is being turned towards deliberately misunderstanding the text, right? Like as you saw with the commas. So we can't let people have this kind of ambiguity in legal text. Okay, so let's look at this example. Okay, so first case, which ingredient is popular? Right, the egg ingredient is popular. It's common to all of these recipes, okay? So if I have peanuts in my pancakes, is the peanut banned? It's banned because it's listed in table A, right? So it takes actually a huge amount of like human background world knowledge to know which and is meant. And in a courtroom, when millions of dollars are on the line, a lot of intelligence is going to be focused on plausible misinterpretation of what the author meant. Right? So this is a situation where like this is why we need to be explicit about whether there's a conjunction or is it a set union, right? So this is and with and this is set union with you. And English uses the same word for both. Okay, here's another example of Annie, okay? This is a good example of existential versus universal quantification. So in this first case, what they're really saying is like choose any one ice cream on the list, right? Here, what they're saying is shoot all the zombies who come through the door, right?
So recently, I went for breakfast, right? And you have to choose like what you wanted before you prepare it. And when they said any, I was a bit confused and I clarified, and they really meant any.
Any of the above. You can have the kaya toast and the chichongfan and the, right? Yeah. So exactly.
I'm not sure whether it's like, the management not have intended it that way.
Yeah.
But when you ask for any, the customer service interpreted on the benefit of the customer, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's right. And so the meaning is actually not clear because if you had asked a different waiter could have given you a different answer, right?
Yeah.
So you were just lucky. So the strategy in that situation is to just like keep asking until you get the right answer. But this is my illustration of how you run into these kinds of problems, right? Like if you've got this sentence, these are like 4 different ways to interpret the same sentence, and they're all correct according to the rules of grammar of English. This is like those puzzles where it's like, how many triangles are there in this thing, right? So this is just like, these are some of the ambiguities that we need our grammar to explicitly distinguish. And in GF, we can do this, right? We can do this pretty easily. And if there are multiple possible interpretations of a sentence, GF will actually like tell us that there are multiple possible interpretations. And that becomes really useful because imagine taking a piece of text, parsing it with GF, and if GF comes up with multiple like logically distinct interpretations of one sentence, then we can say, okay, there's a potential bug in this contract. You need to go and read this sentence carefully. And these are the possible multiple alternatives. Go think about that, right? And usually when you give that sort of like compiler warning to a human, especially the human who actually wrote the text, the human will be upset. The human will be offended, and the human will say, well, obviously I meant this, and any intelligent reader will know that this is what I meant. And you're like, great, would you like to go look at this list of like lawsuits over commas? So that's something that we can fix. So that's kind of where we are. This is, I know you're probably getting tired of listening to me, so I'm just going to show you a few other web pages, and we can just jump forward. So
this remark concerning the ambiguities, I mean,
yes.
As soon as you start formalizing them, they disappeared. So they do not appear in the raw text anymore. If you take the formalized text as a basis.
That's right. So once you formalize this stuff, the natural language that gets compiled out of our text will actually not suffer these problems because we'll have unambiguous representations. Okay, let me give you since we're here, let me give you an example of how it is possible to produce what we call isomorphism. Okay, so Pia Andrews is an expert in the rules as code domain. And a few years ago, I was shitposting on Twitter saying one of the holy grails of computational law is isomorphism between code and English. Because the legal drafters can write the code that compiles to English that ends up as law and also as like an app, right? So Pia was like, yes, this. And so I took that as encouragement and I spent some time working on an example. So our colleagues in New Zealand worked on this piece of code called the rates rebate code. And it looks like this. It's like official New Zealand legislation. And it was written probably like 50 years ago, which is why it is impossible to read. I hope you can see it on the screen. So the natural English text reads like this, right? And if you can read all the way through this sentence and understand it, then I take my hat off to you. Okay, but like it seems pretty clear to me that what they're trying to do here is just specify a very small mathematical formula, but they're trying to do it in English, which is why it goes like that, right? And so I feel like a 12-year-old in school trying to solve a word problem, taking all the words and turning it into like X and Y, right? So the good news is I was able to just like draft up a very simple mathlang language that represented all these things. And then in Haskell, I was able to parameterize with these inputs and run and say, I want to output in the obfuscated natural language style. And so I was able to just like actually produce this text with cool indentation, which is word for word identical to the input text. So that's cool, right? And once you have this word for word isomorphism, you are then able to say, you know, there's actually a bug in this code. Now, the bug isn't actually in the legislation. The bug is in the New Zealand government's representation in their web app. Their web app was producing the wrong answers sometimes. And they're like, where is the bug? So in Haskell, I was able to just like do a couple of range loops and say, if these inputs are this, if these inputs are this, most of the time your whatever entitlement is going to be $630. And over here, your entitlement becomes negative. This was the bug in their like production code. And I was like, okay, there's the problem. What it should be is it should just go to 0, right? And that also turned out to be wrong because that also should start at 0. And it turns out that the bug is really simple. The bug was we were subtracting when we should have been doing something else. We should have been doing this, what I call in excess. So if you happen to be a fan of 80s rock music, you recognize that In Excess is a rock band from New Zealand, actually, which is why they thought this was funny when I presented it. So let me ask you this question, right? If the law says, what is the amount by which A exceeds B? It's going to be A minus B, right? What if B is actually greater than A? Is the answer A minus B, which is a negative number, or is the answer 0? So even like English, like the amount by which A exceeds B, we don't have a clear definition because English is not a formal language. And so that's where the bug was coming from. And so they had to go and fix this bug by just adding like a clip to it. But so the cool thing is, once you can formalize this kind of legislation, you can produce all kinds of like useful representations. You can say, I'm going to work through the numbers. There's an arithmetic representation. You can produce a bunch of YAML for your test suite. And then you can produce like an English explanation of how you think through every single part of this word problem. And you can do it in a grammatical kind of way. So the cool thing here is, like this was done in pure Haskell very, very simply, but I can't wait to convert this to GF, because GF will give us an even more elegant solution to how to produce the natural language here. Okay. So let's see, what tweets did I put up here? Okay, so zooming back out to where we are, and I know that we're like 10 minutes away from lunch, so I'll just try and wrap up at a high level. Gabe is like a teacher of like legal tech. And he was like, okay, so what tools do you teach law students? And I observed that there are no actual law students in this room today, but in the rest of the building, there are a lot. What tech tools, other than like research tools, Westlaw, LexisNexis, what tools are you teaching students to use? And are you teaching them as part of a legal tech class or just like as part of general? And the answers to this question are really telling, because they're like, well, I teach Slack, Trello, Asana, Google Docs, Sheets. I teach how to do track changes in Word, to teach them how to search Edgar, okay? Some other tools, mind mapping, like SharePoint, Forms, Documate. So these are, what was really telling to me was like, what's missing from this, right? Because reading these answers feels like quick survey. If you're a finance or accountant person, what tools are you teaching your students to use? And all the answers would be missing Excel, right? They'd be missing spreadsheets. And that tells me that we're in a world where like the equivalent of the spreadsheet doesn't exist, because Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Word, like the finance people use Excel and the lawyers use Word, but Excel like does a hell of a lot more than Word in terms of like helping you think, right? So what we want to do as part of our project is to build the legal equivalent to a spreadsheet, so that like if they ask this question like 5 years from now, every answer is going to be, we are teaching L4 in class, because that is the language that programmers and lawyers can both use to communicate. So, okay, so that's I hope that makes sense. I hope that, I'm going to show you some examples of things that I think will change. So NDAs, right? Like non-disclosure agreements are kind of the low-hanging fruit in the document assembly world. And here you'll be like, okay, if you type free non-disclosure agreement into Google, this is one of the first results that you get. So they'll be like, here, you can create yourself a non-disclosure agreement. And I'm going to click on this, and it's probably going to ask me like, what are the fields I need to fill in? And it will generate for me a bunch of things. And then at the end of it, I'll have done document assembly, and I will have which is like kind of lame. I mean, it's fine. Like this is the kind of UI that people need, but I would much rather be able to give this as a JSON document that I can like edit on my own terms, and then push it through some sort of API, some sort of software that then produces the actual agreement that I want. Because like the first time you use this wizard, it's like, oh, great, there's a wizard. But the 10th time you use this, you're like, I'm a power user. I don't want to have to like click through this all the time, right? So this is how you end up with a non-disclosure agreement. Yay, I need to download, I need to sign up. Oh, great. Okay, because you know why? Because it's a commercial service and they're gonna like spam me a lot. Great, I just clicked on the spam me button. Now I need to, okay, so I'm like, okay, well that sucked, right? I'm gonna close that tab and I'll be like, oh, look, there's a whole non-disclosure agreement.com where I'm gonna go through the same pain of filling out this form. Oh, there's all this stuff. You know, you're like, okay, I don't want to have to click through like 8 different pages. Can I just edit the JSON, right? Or edit the spreadsheet even. So I'm like, okay, this sucks. I'm gonna close that. All right, here's something that looks a little bit more promising. It's in GitHub and it's available in a bunch of languages. Oh, that's awesome. Hopefully. Oh no, it's not actually, there's not much here. Okay, so this isn't terribly mature, but we'll revisit Common Accord another time, maybe. But it's like, okay, your structure is like, there's a lot of structure and you've got these equal signs. I'm not quite sure what this means. Okay, I'm gonna close that tab. Here's the Waypoint non-disclosure agreement, commonform.org. And oh, great, this is just like, I can copy and paste this straight off the webpage. Awesome, right? So this is all there is to the NDA. And look, oh, wow, cool. You can download this thing in Markdown, in Word, as JSON. They care about versioning. Let's see what this thing looks like. Oh God, it's gonna launch like VS Code. What are you launching? Oh, you're launching full code. Okay, let's install like several hundred megs of stuff. Let's open a JSON file. I have a better idea. Let's open the JSON file. Emacs doesn't have permission to open files because OS 10 is very good at security. Okay, fine. Let's open the file. Ta-da! Well, you want me to like choose a project? No, there it is. Okay, cool. Wow, the whole natural language text of this is in JSON. What does that even look like? What I was expecting. There it is. Wow, look at that. So it's got a whole form and it's got every single like fragment of the sentence has been broken out and defined. And it feels like this is the sort of thing that GF should be able to help me with, right? This is like high level text planning stuff. But like, if I wanted to have this form in a different language, you know, I don't want to go through and edit all this JSON by hand. Okay, so you see these like, even an NDA, which is like the simplest document, really. People are out there saying, oh, guess what? When was this? May 25th, so a few months ago. Big law firm, Hogan Lovells, is excited. I love it when like non-human entities get to be excited about things. Hogan Lovells is excited to be a member of the One NDA Club. Working in collaboration with other law firms, we're going to standardize the NDA to save lawyers and clients time, money, and risk. And so now they've got this like website for onenda.org. They've standardized the NDA. Okay, cool. It looks like a Word document with like a bunch of stuff in it. And if I want to auto-generate this stuff, is there a way I can like give it JSON and just get stuff out? I don't see it. Oh, you download it as a Word document. Agree. Oh, okay. So this isn't as like open as I would expect, right? Like I'm expecting it to be on GitHub, but fine. So like this whole world to me looks like a bunch of lawyers trying to embrace technology without actually coming from the sort of culture of technology. Like we all come from the culture of technology. And so we're all like, where's the thing on GitHub, right? Like, can I just have the template and have the JSON and compose it and get the output document? You can't, because At the end of the day, what you still need to do is open the Word document after signing up to their email spam list, and then you have to email them and say, we've adopted your one NDA system. Congratulations, you've just been asked to sign one NDA. Wow, it's like, it's even self-promotional. Wait, that's it? Okay, so how do I do this? Wait, it's a PDF. It's a PDF. Okay, it's a PDF. Okay.
The one NDA PDF has crashed Meng's machine. So did it run out of battery or?
No, that's good. It's just like,
Okay, so I guess we were pretty much done. We're like,
yeah,
it's pretty much lunchtime. So.
Like today's legal landscape. So what we're gonna do this afternoon is we're gonna go back and try to improve this whole situation using here.
Yeah. Wow, it's gonna be a long day. So so today's plan is to fix legal tech and
we have a few other app grammars that we could also explore. The fluid grammar from Computational.
yeah. But yeah, now we're here in Singapore. We're going for lunch and we'll be back, and then in 3.5 hours from now it's Krasimir's talk. So I think I don't know if we're gonna keep the Zoom on or if we're just gonna do some hands-on work here, but like maybe you two should get some rest.
Okay, so we'll come back in an hour and we will try to do a very simple
Thanks, Inari.
bring some of these ideas together.
Yeah, this has been really interesting. Thanks very much. See you later.
Okay, apologies everyone. We will come back in an hour and we will try to do an application grammar that doesn't crash people's computers. Okay.